Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christian Robles-Baez, and I am a PhD candidate in history at Stanford University, specializing in economic and environmental history. Alongside my colleagues Bailey Martin and Narusa Yamato, I co-chair the History of Capitalism Workshop, an interdisciplinary forum that brings together faculty and grad students from across the humanities and social sciences to study capitalism and economic development through historical lens. The History of Capitalism Workshop is supported and funded by the Stanford Humanities Center and the Global Studies Program, and it is host of this conversation. Today, I have the big pleasure of being joined by two major figures in the social sciences, Professors Alvin Roth and Mark Granovetter. We are recording this conversation here at Stanford University on May 6, 2026, to discuss Professor Roth's forthcoming book, Moral Economics, From Prostitution to Organ Sales, What Controversial Transactions Reveal About How Markets Work. Professor Roth is the Craig and Susan McCaw Professor of Economics at Stanford University. Before joining Stanford, he taught at Harvard University as well as at the Universities of Pittsburgh and Illinois. In 2012, he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his work on the theory of stable allocations and the practice of market design. His research has had a profound impact on game theory, experimental economics, and the design of real-world markets. Many readers will also know his 2015 book, Who Gets What and Why? The New Economics of Matchmaking and Market Design. Professor Granovetter is the John Butler Ford Professor in the Department of Sociology at Stanford. He is one of the foundational figures in economic sociology and social network theory. His articles, The Strength of Weak Ties and Economic Action and Social Structure, The Problem of Embeddedness, have shaped several generations of scholarship across sociology, economics, political science, and history. He's also author of several books, including Getting a Job, 1995, Society and Economy, 2017, and co-author with Richard Swedberg of The Sociology of Economic Life, 2011. What makes today's conversation especially exciting is that Professors Roth and Granovetter approach markets from very different intellectual traditions, economics and sociology, but often end up asking remarkably similar questions about the market and how they function in society. And beyond being colleagues at Stanford, they are also neighbors, which perhaps will make today's conversation a little bit more candid and relaxed than usual. So, Professor Roth, let me begin with a broad question. What is this book about and what motivated you to write it?
Well, as you say, in 2015, I wrote a book called Who Gets What and Why? And that was a cheerful book about market design. It said sometimes markets are broken and we can fix them, and it gave some examples that I'd been involved in. So this book is less cheerful. This is a follow-up that says some markets are broken, but it's going to be hard to fix them because we can't agree on what we want them to do. And so a little bit, I think that this book approaches the substance of the old joke about economists and sociologists, which says that economists study how people make choices, and sociologists study why people don't really have any choices. So this is a book about how we as a society decide what choices we'll allow and what choices we'll try to ban, and how much success we have in doing those things. And maybe one of the big conclusions of the book is that markets need social support to work well, but so do bans on markets.
So you highlight the relationship between markets and society and how they are inherently linked. And from the perspective of economic sociology, Professor Granovetter, what are your general impressions of the book? Like, in which ways do you see it as a contribution to the field?
I don't think it is mainly a book that fits within the parameters of economic sociology, because much of what the book talks about is not mainly economic, I would say. Many of the issues are not mainly economic, even if they have economic causes and consequences, like organ transplants. That's not an economic activity, although it has economic aspects. Same-sex marriage, or relationships, assisted dying. There are others that are mainly economic, such as payday loans and charging of interest on loans. So I think economic sociology would pay more attention to issues like that. But I think all of these issues are of great interest. So I don't particularly care whether they fit within some narrow definition of economic sociology.
I am hardly able to say whether this book fits within economic sociology, but I think that all of those things you mentioned fit nicely within economics, because economics isn't just about commodity markets and prices. It's about how to allocate scarce resources efficiently and equitably and how to make them less scarce. So when you talk about something like kidney transplants, that comes right to the fore.
You said that without quoting Ernest Henry Phelps Brown.
Just quoting his name and knowing where the hyphens go would have been a challenge for me.
I think every English economist has 4 names. He's the one that said the thing about sociology and economics, which is quite wrong-headed, by the way.
But funny.
Well, I didn't think so when I first heard it, but some people might have been amused.
You've quoted that in one of your articles, I think, the sentence about or the joke between.
Yeah, probably disapprovingly. I don't remember.
Yeah. No, sense of humor is a scarce resource.
It doesn't have a price, I don't think, does it?
It's priceless.
It's priceless, yes. Right. Okay, we agree on that. Is it one of our turns now to say something?
I think it's probably your turn.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a book.
And that exempts you from taking a turn?
Well, so you read the book. So now I could tell you what's in the book, but alternatively you could say it was really hard to tell what was in the book. Why don't you tell me about it?
So I guess the question I might ask, how can I put this question, is that you talk about repugnant transactions and repugnancy as a force that slows down markets. I don't remember exactly what word you used, but I
wrote a paper that talked about repugnance as a constraint on markets.
Constrains markets, yes, that's right. So I guess what I would like to do, and maybe this is more of a comment than a question, but it seems to me that the examples you talked about could be disaggregated into several different categories, not all of which really are mainly about repugnancy. But that's not a question, is it?
Well, you make it a question with the inflection of your voice.
Yes, that's right.
So repugnance was in the working title of the book, but is not in the title of the book. What is in the subtitle of the book is controversial transactions and markets. Right. And one reason, so let me tell you how I define repugnance and what I think of it as. I say in the book that I'll call a transaction repugnant if some people would like to engage in it and other people think they shouldn't be allowed to, mostly for moral or religious reasons, and without any easily measurable harm accruing to the person who objects. So the way I put it in the book is this transaction they object to, they might not even know has happened unless someone tells them. And a prototypical example of repugnant transactions defined that way are same-sex marriage. 2 people want to marry each other, and there are people who apparently object to that, sometimes quite forcefully. We had a long political discussion of that in the United States. But you can't tell whether someone is married unless they tell you, and they often do that by wearing a wedding ring. So the harms that people feel might accrue to them, and therefore they don't like same-sex marriage, are not of the easily measurable kind. But one reason I didn't use that term, repugnance, in the title of the book is people would naturally say to me, what kind of transactions do you think are repugnant? And I would say, as I've just said, well, how about same-sex marriage? And they'd say, oh, you disapprove of same-sex marriage? And I'd say, no. When I say a transaction is repugnant, I mean some people disapprove of it and some people very much approve of it. And I'm not telling you what I think or what you should think. I'm describing as a social scientist the political controversies that arise.
Right. Can I comment on this statement?
You certainly can.
I can, okay.
But see if you can.
Yes. I can and I will. I didn't say may I, so I should have said that. So I would suggest disaggregating repugnance into 4 different categories. The first one is what I would call true repugnance, where repugnance is a kind of visceral reaction to something that people find it really disgusting, for example, and disgusting varies among people, but people who feel it certainly feel it viscerally. So that's one. Now another one, the second one, is when people have moral objections to transactions, and those may not be visceral. They may be quite cerebral, for example. So, for example, same-sex marriage is often like that. People aren't necessarily emotionally involved in it or don't necessarily feel it viscerally, but they feel as a moral principle that it should be impermissible. And I think if that does not accompany, so I a lot of what I think about this is that it's very much bound up with how emotionally and physiologically and viscerally people feel what they think about why a transaction should not be allowed. And I think that if they have a moral objection, it may often not be particularly visceral. It can be quite cerebral. And I think that same-sex marriage, one example. Another one is underage sex. And here there's an interesting empirical question, which is why there's such enormous variation, not only among U.S. states, but also among countries, in what the age of consent is. You might think it's not a huge variation because it ranges in the United States between 13 and 18. But I think being a 13-year-old and being an 18-year-old are quite different. So
and the variation also exists over time, right? Like not only geographically, but also over time.
It has changed somewhat over time, but it's been comparatively stable, actually. And I'm not sure anyone has ever studied where this comes from. And actually, there are exceptions for 13-year-olds if the partner is close enough in age, because that's somehow thought of as consensual, whereas a 13-year-old having relations with a 28-year-old would not be considered consensual. So that's one of the differences. But I've never seen a study of this. Paying organ donors, blood plasma donors, in fact, most Americans do approve of that.
But many people overseas don't approve of it and
no, that's right.
consequently import plasma from the United States, which is the Saudi Arabia of blood plasma.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. So those are all very interesting cases. Now, then we have Eliot Spitzer. Eliot Spitzer is a very interesting case. And in your book, you say that people have reacted to. So Eliot Spitzer was, I guess he was the mayor. Was he?
He was the governor of New York.
He was the governor of New York,
having been the attorney general before.
Oh, that's right. Having been attorney general, and he was very morally upright and very concerned about upholding moral standards. And then it turned out that he was having fairly regular relations with a prostitute. So, and you have described people's reaction to this as one of repugnance. I would have said that it's less repugnance or disgust than it is what I would call moral objection. And in particular, I would call it even more than moral objection. I would call it anger about hypocrisy. So I think the empirical question is, how widespread is it as a way of reacting to things that people get angry about people acting hypocritically? And I think that's an empirical question. We don't know. But I think that was really what was involved with Eliot Spitzer, because on the one hand, he was a crusader against any kind of relationships like the one he was in fact having. So he was a hypocrite. So hypocrisy, I think, is a very interesting category to think about in this context.
So I agree with you. And in fact, I think I wrote in the book that he was a victim of his own hypocrisy.
Yes,
but the
clearly.
thing he was hypocritical about was prostitution, which is a repugnant transaction in the sense that there are some people who want to engage in it and other people who think it should be outlawed, which it is in most of the United States. But one reason it was an interesting example is he engaged with a very high-end escort, and she gave interviews. And one of them was in the New York Times, and I quoted it. And what she said was she was a music student, and this was not a bad way to support her ambition to become a musician. Many of her classmates were waiting on tables, which was much more time-consuming and soul-destroying than what she was doing, where she met these nice, hygienic men, and was paid quite a bit more than you get waitressing. So what I was interested in pointing out was that she at least was a voluntary sex worker, right, who we have criminalized in society. But in particular, she was not a trafficked woman or a child. She was an adult. And part of the issue for economists in thinking about how to regulate markets like this is it possible to take some of the burden off voluntary sex workers that they now face by being criminals, without expanding the scope of the market for trafficked women and children who are slaves. And so I think the market design question is how to do that. And I have some proposals about that in the book.
Yes, absolutely. And I wasn't talking so much about that as I was talking about Eliot Spitzer and why people were outraged about that case. And I think it had to do with his hypocrisy. So I think that's a category of transactions that people find repugnant, and that those are transactions where people engaging in them are hypocrites.
One of the transactions that many Americans respond to surveys that they find repugnant is adultery, which of course is one of the 10 Commandments. Don't commit adultery. But there's quite a bit of adultery, so there must be quite a bit of hypocrisy also.
Well, we'd have to discuss what proportion of cases of adultery involve hypocrisy. I think that's a complicated question, which I think we don't have time to really have a complete discussion of. And I can't say that I really have any idea about this, and I don't think anyone has ever studied. I've never seen a comprehensive study of adultery, and that may be partly because if you try to put it into the general social survey, you might not get the kind of responses you were hoping for.
I agree that I don't know of comprehensive studies of adultery, but there are studies of its incidence, and it's highly disapproved of by Americans, but it's not non-existent by any means.
That's right, and what we don't know is what proportion of those people who disapprove of it also engage in it.
Yeah. But the numbers, in order for there to be as much adultery as there is, and given how much disapproval of there is,
there has to be some overlap.
Yes, there's some overlap.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. No, that's a very interesting question. It's perhaps more in the realm of sociological research than economic research. Although there may be is there an economic aspect or consequence of adultery?
There are certainly economic consequences of adultery, but I agree.
Other than divorce.
That's a big other.
Yeah, it is.
I think you're quite right. There are many things we're still waiting for our sociology colleagues to study.
Yes. Well, I am hoping that my colleagues, probably not myself, will take up this challenge. So another case, which I think is a little different from these others, is resentment of people going out of turn, jumping a queue, people getting a vaccine before others who should be a higher priority, or countries getting vaccines earlier if they paid more. And I would say in those cases what we're seeing is not so much repugnance as indignation. So I want to make a distinction between indignation and repugnance, because repugnance is more visceral, I would say, than indignation. I think indignation is more intellectual. I'm not sure anyone has ever studied this.
So we're talking a little at cross purposes, because I use the word repugnant to characterize transactions,
yes,
and you're using it to characterize emotions. And I think that you can – I'm not a brain scientist, but I think you can recruit the disgust areas of your brain to say, you wouldn't like your daughter to marry someone of the opposite political party, and you can feel disgusted by that. But when I talk about disgust as distinct from repugnance, I'm talking about this visceral reaction in a manner that I've read in some evolutionary psychology studies. They think that disgust is a more universal reaction to things like body fluids, things that could cause you to have infection. So there's a law in California that makes it a felony to eat horse meat. So you can't sell horse meat for human consumption. I misstated myself. It's not a felony to eat horse meat. It's a felony to sell horse meat for human consumption. And that's not an ancient cowboy law. It's a result of a 1998 referendum. And you might feel disgusted that someone wants to eat horse meat if you regard horses as pets, but they don't feel disgusted. That's something that people differ on. There are a lot of parts of the world where horses are delicious. But there's no law against restaurants selling you a drink made of someone else's saliva, right? No one wants to drink that. That's disgusting. That's perhaps a universal evolutionary adaptable reaction that keeps you from getting diseases. So the very nature of repugnant transactions is they're not universal. There are people who want to do them and people who don't want you to do them. Whereas disgust, I think, when I talk about something as disgusting, no one is going to sell you a drink made of spit. There's no market for that. That's universally disgusting.
But there are certainly things that are disgusting to some people and not to others.
Well, like marrying someone of the opposite political party. I think you can recruit the brain cells to help you remember that you really don't like the opposite political party.
Or the same sex. It would be an even better example. Some people find it disgusting and other people find it perfectly normal and, in fact, have perhaps engaged in it. I don't know if I should tell you this, but when I was a graduate student, I actually dined on horse meat at the Harvard Faculty Club because at that time it was available on the menu. I am guessing that, and I'm pretty sure that it's no longer on the menu. Has not been for many years. It's no longer
on the menu. Unlike in California, it's not illegal to sell horse meat for human consumption in Massachusetts, but you can't buy it. And the reason is Congress, having failed to pass laws when they attempted to make laws against selling horse meat, they lined out the part of the Department of Agriculture budget that allows the Department of Agriculture to inspect horse meat. So you can't easily eat any meat in the U.S. that isn't Department of Agriculture grade A, and there's no horse meat that is inspected that way. So you might be able to get imported, horse sausage from France, but you can't get horse meat at the Harvard Faculty Club anymore.
Is there imported horse sausage?
Well, there is horse sausage. I don't know if it's imported.
Yeah, no, there's an interesting question that we probably have to put aside for another day.
Yeah, or another meal. Yeah.
Yes, one or the other, or perhaps both. So, I think that when I say that we are seeing indignation in the case of people getting vaccines out of turn rather than repugnance, I think the degree of objection to a transaction may depend on what its consequences are. And if it depends on the consequences, then it seems to me that's not so much about repugnance as it is about something else. And in moral philosophy, there's a distinction between moral principles that are intrinsic. The word they use is deontological.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Yeah, it sounds very fancy, doesn't it? Or consequential. So whether it's some kind of intrinsic, innate, immediate reaction to a situation, to a moral situation, or if it's a decision about what to do based on what the consequences are, so making a moral principle consequential. So I think that there's something there that is interesting for our case here.
Mm-hmm. So on that, I'm not a 100% consequentialist, but what I write about is I think that even if you have a deontological objection to some transaction and you would like to ban it, if you find you can't ban it, you have to at least think about how to handle the consequences. So heroin is a good example. I think many people agree it would be nice if there was no heroin, and we have really tough laws about heroin. And when we catch dealers, we put them in jail, and we have a lot of prisoners of that sort. We have a lot of overdose deaths, and we have a lot of addicts. So we agree we shouldn't have heroin, but we have heroin.
But that's almost entirely consequentialist, isn't it?
Well, it's. I think we have to think about the consequences. It's not. We could decide that we don't like heroin for purely non-consequential reasons, but given that we have a lot of heroin, we also have to think about how to deal with it. And simply saying we don't like it and you should go to jail is not working the way we might want it to work. One example I use in the book is I say, why is it so easy to buy drugs and so hard to hire a hitman? And we really don't like contract killers, but our ban on contract killing is working pretty well. There are very, very few contract killings in the United States. And in fact, there are fewer homicides of any sort than there are drug overdose deaths.
And I have to tell you, I have a hitman in my family, I had a hitman in my family. He's no longer with us. And
it's a dangerous job.
It is, no doubt. And whenever I would ask my mother or her sister about him, they would immediately change the subject. So they obviously had an aversion to talking about this. I would say repugnance to talking about it. And he was quite famous. He was, if you look up Harold Boom Boom Königsberg, you'll find out.
Boom Boom gives it away.
Well, it actually. That referred actually to his preferred method of assassinating people, which was to strangle them.
Oh.
Yeah, which you might not expect.
Right.
But anyway, I digress.
I think like a key aspect of repugnant markets are precisely that the perceived social consequences of it, right? And when people debate what you were talking about, like involving alcohol or drugs, people often centers the discussion not only on the transaction itself, but also on its broader effects like violence, crime, as you were describing, addiction, public health issues, and other forms of social harm. But so this makes us think that studying moral or repugnant markets requires evaluation of those consequences, right? But this seems an extraordinarily difficult task to do, because the effects of markets or even prohibiting markets can be diffuse or long-term or highly context-dependent.
Or unpredictable.
And some consequences may only emerge decades later also, while others vary across societies in historical moments. So, Professor Roth, how do you think about the challenge of identifying or measuring the broader implications of moral contested markets? Like, how policymakers or scholars can gauge or evaluate these consequences when they are often indirect, delayed, or difficult to quantify?
Well, lots of things that are difficult to predict are nevertheless amenable to being studied. So, the reason I talked about heroin and hitmen is we have very similar laws trying to limit them, but the law limiting hitmen, which is when we catch them, we put them in prison for as long as we can, works very well. We have very little commercial killing outside of the Granovetter family.
He wasn't a Granovetter.
Right. Well, but he somehow is related to your mother and sister.
Yeah.
Yes.
And probably distantly, or at least they would have argued that.
Yeah. But so we can tell that market, that ban on commercial killing is working much better than the ban on selling and purchasing heroin, because we have a lot of overdose deaths. We have a lot of bad consequences that since we have them, we have to deal with them. That's not a moral question. It's a question of social policy. There are lots of deaths from drugs, not nearly as many as there are from tobacco or from alcohol, but these are also things that we tried to prohibit alcohol during Prohibition. We found that it didn't work very well, that there was still plenty of alcohol and there was also lots of organized crime. So, in the 1920s we prohibited alcohol, and in the 1930s we changed that amendment to the Constitution and made alcohol legal. And of course the problems of alcohol didn't go away when we made it legal. There's still alcoholism. There's still drunk driving. Alcohol is a problematic beverage. But you can't buy moonshine whiskey from gangsters anymore. The black market for alcohol was outcompeted by the fancy market for whiskey.
You haven't been in Kentucky lately.
I haven't been in Kentucky lately. And indeed, in the NASCAR Museum, they have a still, among their folk heroes are people who ran liquor to town,
right,
moonshine,
right,
by the light of the moon.
Yes, I guess that's where the name comes from. Yeah, absolutely. Although a lot more people are interested in alcohol or heroin than they are in contract killing.
Well, but that's partly because we put contract killers in jail, so it's not a good labor market choice.
I don't think that's the only reason. I think that
I agree.
There aren't that many people who enjoy killing other people.
Well, we have – so now I'm very rough numbers from the FBI crime statistics. We have about 20,000 homicides a year in the United States. But
yes, but most of those are within families.
By people who love you, absolutely.
Yeah, right. Don't love you quite enough.
Yes. But hardly any of those are contract killings. Whereas there are years where we have 100,000 opioid overdose deaths, things like that. So, But think about other things like being an electrician. If I need to have my house rewired, that's dangerous. Electricity is dangerous. So I hire a professional to do it. So there are 20,000 people who would have liked to hire a professional to murder someone they loved, but that market isn't available. So they might have to do it themselves.
You counted that?
Well, I'm looking at the total number of homicides.
Oh, okay. Right.
So there might be many more who are deterred from homicide by the fact that they'd have to do it themselves, which is messy and dangerous. I mean, Boom Boom sounds like he was a mess.
No, he was quite happy with his work, I think.
Well, but he may have left a mess behind.
Oh, of course, yes. No question about that.
So,
and he did die in prison in upstate New York.
Well, upstate New York is known for its prisons. Many graduates of my high school went up the river.
Really? Okay.
To Ossining, New York, Sing Sing prison.
I'm not sure if that's where he was, but it was one of those.
Yeah. So I think you can't – it's hard to predict the consequences, but we can look back on the success of those policies. And I think looking back on the success, we should keep trying to deter contract killing. We're doing a very good job of that. There's not very much of it. But we should reconsider whether we should start to possibly somewhat treat heroin addicts more like patients than like criminals, because we have a lot of deaths and we not only regret the heroin and the addiction, we regret the deaths. So it's something we have to deal with. It may not be a moral question, but if we think it's a moral imperative to criminalize heroin and stop there, well, then we have these messy consequences to deal with, like the consequences of your not quite Granovetter relative. My
distant cousin.
Your distant cousin, made more distant by the fact that your mother wouldn't talk about him.
Nor her sister.
Sounds like he was a distant uncle, maybe.
We never were able to establish that because they never would say anything about it. Mm-hmm. But we knew he was in the family.
Wonderful.
We didn't know exactly how. So I think to change the subject slightly, I think that one source of repugnancy has to do with consent or the lack of consent. So, for example, I think people are much more upset about child pornography than about prostitution between consenting adults, because there's an assumption that children involved in child pornography have not actually consented.
And have been abused.
And most likely have been abused, yes. So I think consent is a very serious issue. And this may be why there is so little repugnancy directed against what you might think would be repugnant actors, like payday lenders, for example, or check cashing services, because there's consent. The people who are using those services more or less know what they're getting into.
Right. So keeping in mind that you're using the word repugnant in an entirely different way than I use it, remember that my definition of a repugnant transaction implies consent. It says a transaction is repugnant when there are some people who want to do it and other people who don't want them to. So one of the problems of sex work, of prostitution, is that there's this there are voluntary sex workers, and there are also trafficked women and children who
Yes,
do not consent.
Involuntary, involuntary sex workers.
Yes, so involuntary sex workers are being assaulted. They're being enslaved. I mean, that's a different sort of crime than.
So consent is obviously important.
Consent is important, but I'm talking about the transaction, not the view of it. So I sometimes use the word repulsive in the book, maybe the way you're now speaking of repugnance. Are people repulsed by some transactions that may also be repugnant?
Yeah, well, we can't say they're repugnanted, so we need another word.
Right, so I try to use another word.
Right. Yeah.
The problem is that the line between consent and coercion is not always very clean. In the cases of prostitutions or even organ sales, it's difficult to tell.
And even child pornography, although we assume that the children have been forced to do it, but that may not always be true depending on the age of the child.
Right. But children cannot legally consent.
Legally, certainly not. Yeah, that's right.
But so, yeah, like the line between freedom or consent and coercion often seem much more blurred than we assume. And basically, how can we tell if a transaction is actually free, is actually consent or not? If it's like untouched by the pressure of structural or other types of constraints, one could argue that most people, for example, sell their labor because they need an income in order to survive, but that necessarily makes it like a coercive decision.
Well, certainly what Marxists would say.
Well, so, but the question basically is, how do you think about the line between voluntary exchange and coercion in your work?
So I talk about that a good deal. There is a concern that vulnerable people can be exploited and that adding money to some transactions make them coercive. So we have about 7,000 living donor kidney transplants a year. So there are 7,000 people who donate a kidney to someone to be transplanted without being paid. It's against the law to be paid. And we celebrate them, right? If the thing about kidneys is healthy people have two kidneys and can remain healthy with one. So if someone you loved was dying of kidney failure, you could save their life by giving them a kidney, and it would be an expression of your love, and everyone who knows you and them would celebrate both of you. But if you are paid for your kidney, it's a felony in the United States. And in most parts of the world, it's against the law to pay someone for a kidney. So that's a case where money enters into it in this very special way. And in a lot of medical things, I talk a lot about kidneys, but I also talk a lot about blood plasma. There's a big shortage of kidneys, so one way to alleviate it might be to try to be more generous to kidney donors and to think about regulated ways of compensating them and inspiring them to donate a kidney.
Also attempts to use animal kidneys, as you know.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many attempts. Some of them will take longer than others to save the lives of the people who need them. But another very similar debate goes on about donating blood plasma. And in much of the world, it's illegal to pay plasma donors. But there isn't the same worldwide shortage of plasma that there is of kidneys. And one of the reasons is in the United States, we allow plasma donors to be paid, and we export tens of billions of dollars of plasma and plasma products each year to countries that can't get as much as they need for all the medical uses that plasma now has from unpaid domestic donors. And I think that no country that doesn't compensate its plasma donors is self-sufficient in plasma. They all have to import from the United States.
Mm-hmm. So you have like a very broad understanding of markets, which includes forms of exchange in which money is not necessarily involved, right? But I wonder whether for some people, part of what makes certain exchanges repugnant is precisely the act of framing them as markets in the first place. So in other words, the market framing itself can generate moral discomfort. Take marriage, for example. Some people are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of marrying or a marriage market, right? That because it seems that people are commodities. People go to a market and choose and pick up. So the idea of seeing these things as market can be objectionable for some people, or religion. While individuals may choose among different religions, many believers would reject the idea that their religions operate like products. Basically, the question is, can the very language or conceptualization of the market itself become repugnant? And like, can people object not only to particular transactions, but also to the idea of interpreting certain human relationships and practices through a market framework?
I think that the word market is indeed a controversial one, and I use it, as you say, very broadly. So in particular, much of my work has been done at about studying markets that are not commodity markets. So let's think for just a moment what a commodity market is. A commodity market is a market like the New York Stock Exchange, where when you're buying shares of Microsoft, they're all the same. So you don't care who you're buying them from. You're not making a relationship. All that is needed for the market to do is define a price at any moment at which transactions can happen. There are sellers and buyers. When they agree on a price, there's a transaction. You don't care who the seller is. You don't have a relationship with them. But a labor market is not like that. When you offer someone a job, you're offering it to a particular person. When you're being offered a job, it's a particular job. It's not just a wage. When you get a job as a historian, the first question your colleagues will ask you is not, what's the salary? They'll say, where are you working? What's the job? So there are lots of markets in which people are not commodities at all, even if they are paid as we are. And the question of whether being paid coerces you, that's a different sort of question. But I agree with you that that I'm paid for teaching economics at Stanford, but I don't feel coerced. I feel privileged. It's a great job. But I would teach a lot less economics over the course of my career if I couldn't earn my living as an economist and as a teacher of economics. So I think money is not essential for markets. Markets are about allocating scarce resources. But in matching markets, prices don't do all the work. You can't just attend Stanford to study just because you can afford the tuition. You have to be admitted. And Stanford can't just decide who will study at Stanford. We have to compete with Berkeley and Arizona State and Harvard. So matching markets are markets where you can't just choose what you want. Even if you can afford it, you also have to be chosen. And marriage markets are like that. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And in some marriage markets, there are dowries and bride prices. But in American marriage markets, mostly there are not. But I think that if you're on a dating site or a matrimonial site, it's very easy to see the market-like environment that matching for matrimony is. So I have no trouble in speaking about a marriage market.
Well, I haven't spent any time on those sites, I have to say. But a footnote would be that my former colleague Bruce Carruthers has written a book on 17th century England where he shows, among other things, that when people were trading shares of the East India Company, which was a very big deal, Whigs would only buy from Whigs and Tories would only buy from Tories. They were very averse to buying from people of the opposite party. So our modern sense that it doesn't matter who we buy it from was not always the case.
Well, but that's partly because the markets were not well developed and designed. It used to be, so every field of wheat is different. So it used to be that if you bought wheat or coffee, you had to inspect it. That is, you had to see how much red wheat and how much white wheat was in the field, how much moisture was in the grain. But the Chicago Board of Trade has commodified wheat. When you buy 5,000 bushels of number 2 hard red winter wheat, you don't have to inspect it. They've inspected it for you.
Yes, but markets in the 17th century were pretty well developed otherwise, but this particular case was one that was very much mired in politics. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's a footnote. I want to say that I think it would be very valuable and important to have empirical investigations of where some of the repugnancy comes from and what the distribution is of it. So one example is that there is enormous repugnancy in almost all of Africa toward homosexuality. And I'm not sure why it should be so much more repugnant in that continent than other continents. But I think the answer to that would probably be very interesting. So there may be other cases like that where the distribution of repugnancy is very complicated and we don't know why it is what it is. But I think that I'm not sure who would do those studies, whether sociologists or economists would be the ones to do it.
Or historians, because it looks like a very historical concept, like, something that is very specific to certain places and specific time periods, moments in time. By the way, are you interested in how moral standards surrounding markets and exchanges change across cultures, geographies, and historical periods as well? How those changes shape the functioning of markets themselves?
Okay, so let me separate that out, try to answer differently about time and about place. So certainly what are repugnant transactions is not universal, especially if you measure it by laws, what's legal and what's illegal. So I gave a talk in Berlin once about controversial transactions and repugnant markets. And I focused on three. I focused on prostitution, surrogacy, and kidney exchange. And those were good choices for an American speaking in Berlin because the German laws are exactly the opposite of the American laws. The only one of those three that's legal in Germany was prostitution, and surrogacy and kidney exchange were illegal. The German
what year was this?
Just before COVID, so maybe 2019.
So pretty recent.
Pretty recent. Now, right now, as we speak, the German Ministry of Health is trying to move a bill that will legalize kidney exchange in Germany. But right now it's not legal in Germany. You can only get a transplant from a member of your immediate family. So
did people have an explanation for why that was the case
in
Germany?
No, they didn't. I think. I mean, I talked to economists who are willing to listen to me, but I think most people would think that most Germans would think, and most Americans think, we've gotten it about right. Surrogacy should be legal and prostitution should be illegal. But that sentence isn't grammatical in German; it's just the opposite in German. So, in different times and places, different things are regarded as repugnant enough to have laws against.
And
so
if we can understand the source of those differences, that would go some distance toward solving practical problems, although it wouldn't necessarily
So
go
with,
all
with
the way.
my colleague Stephanie Wang, I conducted a survey of general population on those three markets in several countries, but including the U.S. and Germany. And one of the things we found is that that surrogacy and kidney exchange got a lot of popular support both where they were legal and where they were not. And prostitution did not get a lot of support both where it was legal and where it was not. So the question, should it be legal? Should there be?
So there's a disjunction between what people think and what laws look like.
Yes. So I think that the simple hypothesis that things are against the law where the population hates them and they're not against the law where the population loves them is not a correct description.
No, it's obviously false.
And there are markets that were repugnant, like I think you describe in your book, like the credit markets at some point were repugnant, the idea that someone can charge interest for
that's
money.
Right. So historically, we're now much more willing to charge interest than the medieval church was.
Correct. But then there are other markets that were not repugnant, and today they are repugnant.
Like slavery.
Slavery, yeah, exactly.
And indentured servitude, which is more a repugnant transaction in the sense that it was voluntary. It was the most common way for people to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean when we were British colonies.
Well, voluntary, of course, is a relative term.
Well,
people felt coerced.
If you wanted to cross the ocean, you had to pay for it, and that was a way to pay for it. But
you might have felt like you had to do that because you were in intolerable conditions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
And of course, as Christian said, I mean, lots of jobs have that quality, right?
Yeah.
Including our jobs. I mean,
so I wondered, going back to Germany. Do you have any idea what the situation would have been like with respect to those kinds of transactions in East Germany before 1989?
I don't. I didn't survey East Germans before 1989. So I just don't know
and
the
probably
answer.
No one did, but we know.
And no one will now.
Well, clearly not. But I have the sense, and maybe it's from watching movies about East Germany, that East Germans were rather puritanical. But I don't know how that would relate to it. And, of course, we could look at Russia, which is very much like the former Soviet Union in many ways. And I don't know what the laws look like there. Do you have any idea?
No, I'm actually don't know the Russian laws.
No.
But surrogacy, in England, say, is like kidney donation in much of the world. Surrogacy is legal in England, but you can't pay the surrogate. Surrogacy is illegal in Germany and in France and Spain. But the fact that it's legal here in California and in now almost every American state means that it's a hard ban to enforce. When you make a law against surrogacy in France, you are preventing poor women from coming to California and having a surrogate, but you're not preventing prosperous women from doing so. So
because it's expensive to come to California.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. So we're seeing this with abortion now in the United States, right? And so some of these controversial markets that you think might have been settled for a long time, come back to us. So right, Roe v. Wade gave American women the right to abortion in certain parts of the pregnancy, and now it's up to the states. And when Justice Thomas was writing his concurring opinion to the Dobbs decision, which revoked Roe v. Wade rights to abortion, he said we should similarly correct the errors about Griswold versus Connecticut, which was rights to buy contraception, and other cases which were, consensual sex, striking down bans on consensual sex between adults and on same-sex marriage, of course.
If you remember the hearings that took place before he was appointed to the court, it's kind of ironic that he would say that.
It is kind of ironic. And, of course, he benefited from the state of Loving versus the case of Loving versus Virginia, which struck down bans on interracial marriages.
That's right.
Since this conversation is part of the History of Capitalism Workshop, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between repugnant markets and capitalism more broadly. Like markets that society consider morally problematic have existed for a very long time, certainly before capitalism, as we discussed earlier. What do you think capitalism as a form of economic and cultural organization has transformed the nature of moral or repugnant markets in distinctive ways? Like, has modern economic growth, commodification, or the expansion of market logics into more areas of life changed how society define the moral boundaries of markets? Or how do you understand the relationship between moral markets or repugnant markets and the history of capitalism itself?
And if I can just add a corollary to what Christian is asking, it means we would have to look to see what's the case in China for all of these issues, because it's the only large communist country, which is, well, of course, some would argue that it's really a kind of capitalist country, but the leaders of China don't think so.
Well, China has been undergoing a lot of change. And of course,
in these issues,
in these and other issues, yes. Yeah. So I'm not a historian. So we might need to talk to some prehistorians to know about the full history of markets, because certainly the archaeological evidence suggests that our distant prehistoric ancestors knew something about trade. You find stone tools distributed far from the quarries where the stones were dug. So it looks like there was trade in the Middle East and in China and in Europe before there was money, before there was writing. Money, of course, was a great invention for market design. It made it possible to deal more broadly with people who you didn't necessarily know and weren't related to, and who you didn't see over and over again. So some of the early economic relations were no doubt repeated relationships in kin groups, but money made it possible to engage with people who you weren't related to, and So money is one of the foundations of capitalism. But I think that I want to say globalization, but what I mean is extending beyond the kin group and further and further. Having the ability to deal with people who you may never meet, as you do when you buy Microsoft shares from them. It is one of the big things that has affected human society over time in ways that sociologists might sometimes regret. The question is, what's the role of money in overturning traditional social hierarchies? All of a sudden, people who have a lot of money have social status that maybe only old people are supposed to have, gray-haired people. So capitalism is part of that. One question is what to compare it to, and comparing it to feudalism, say, where you belong to the land and can be sold with it. You're a serf. By and large, I would think the benefits of capitalism have been very great if we compare it to feudalism. Digitization of markets is another big thing that allows markets to have more scope and allows you to work with, to transact with people who you don't know, for good and for ill. So one measure, I don't know how to measure human welfare over time, but one measure is healthy longevity. And life expectancies at birth are much greater today than they were 200 years ago or even 100 years ago. So by and large, I think this progress in human welfare has accompanied capitalism, which is full of problems. I'm a market designer. I think that markets have to be fixed when they're broken, and they're often broken. They don't often do the things we want them to do. But if you're just asking me yes or no, have markets been and capitalism been good for humanity? I think they have been.
And technology also has enabled the rise of more markets, including repugnant markets, right? Like with technology we have, AI, I think you mentioned at some point, enabled the development of new repugnant markets as well.
No, AI is a different question. Of course, we might ask, what do we do when AI makes repugnant suggestions, as it often does?
Sure, and also not just artificial intelligences, but organic intelligences make those too. I think that if there were no poverty in the world, there'd be much less repugnance. Much of the repugnance comes from the fear or the concern about exploiting the poor. So one reason there are laws in many places against paying plasma donors, or kidney donors for that matter, is the fear that the global north would suck the blood out of the global south,
so to speak.
So to speak.
It's like poverty as a way of coercion, right?
Right, and that we'd be taking advantage of poor people. And right now there's the European Parliament and the World Health Organization still insist that countries should be self-sufficient in plasma. But countries are not self-sufficient in plasma. Instead, they buy it from the United States, and we are not a poor country. So relaxing this demand for self-sufficiency and allowing sub-Saharan African countries to buy plasma from the U.S., as rich countries in Europe do, we should still worry that maybe the traffic would all go the other way and the rich countries would be sucking the blood out of the poor countries. But that's not what's happening now. It's people are buying plasma from the United States, which is a rich country. So preventing some countries from participating in that market causes lots of deaths in sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, the use of blood and plasma is very much like its use when blood banks were first developed in World War I, where the people who are being treated are people who are bleeding, and they're dying from loss of blood, from traffic accidents, from childbirth. So there are a lot of avoidable deaths that.
So who would have to change that?
Well, foreign aid organizations would have to change it. The World Health Organization would be really helpful if they didn't insist that countries be self-sufficient. They're quite influential in this. And there's also been a movement that demands that countries be self-sufficient in transplantation. And I just chaired a working group at a consensus conference this past November in Cairo, Egypt, where we're trying to overturn that received wisdom, because when you have kidney exchange, which is a tool for avoiding the repugnance of paying donors, but it allows transplantation to be expanded in a way that each patient gets a compatible kidney from some other patient's intended donor. It's natural that small countries and countries with only small kidney exchange can't do a good job of that. So I went during COVID, wearing masks a lot and being tested every day, I went to the United Arab Emirates to help participate in the first kidney exchange between the UAE and Israel. And the story there is those are two countries, both have good medical facilities, but they only have 10 million population. And that's too small a population to be able to find compatible kidneys for hard-to-match patients. So it's a good thing that they don't have to be self-sufficient, although not everyone agrees that that's a good thing. So that's something we're trying to change.
Has the technology for preserving kidneys for transportation improved very much over the years?
It has improved more than the practice has improved. So right now, mostly, and it's changing, but mostly organs are transmitted in ice, right? So they're just cold. But there's warm perfusion is now possible, ways to keep the organ alive while running saline through it and things like that. So, but of course, one reason people are reluctant to do that is ice doesn't break down on an airplane, and if it did, you could ask the stewardess for more ice. But if you have a machine that its red lights start beeping and you're at 30,000 feet, you might lose the organ. But that's coming. We're going to have better ways to preserve and transport organs.
And if there was a dramatic improvement in that, what do you think the consequence of that would be?
So for deceased donor organs, there's a big shortage of both deceased donor organs and living donor organs. Deceased donor organs, if you say countries have to be self-sufficient, I think it doesn't shock the conscience so much because we're talking about who gets this limited resource. And there is some trade. European, there's Eurotransplant, which sometimes someone is so hard to match that there's only one kidney that he could use, and that will go to him. And we do that in the United States too. We transplant organs with regional priority. Someone close to the dead person is more likely to get the organ than a similar patient far away. But if you have a perfect genetic match for a kidney, it goes anywhere in the country. So there's cooperation, but the scope of cooperation is not as great in deceased donor allocation, as long as the deceased organs are so scarce, as it is in kidney exchange, where kidney exchange, the fact that the UAE and Israel were able to overcome all their difficulties in order to help save lives mutually through kidney exchange makes me hope that one day the U.S. and Canada are going to be able to do it. Because every time I go to Canada to talk about this, the transplant professionals all say, what a great idea. But it would take a year of work by bureaucrats to overcome the bureaucratic obstacles, because medicine is paid for differently in Canada and hospitals are accredited differently in Canada. And I think a year of work by, Department of Health and Human Services and Canadian Blood and Tissue Services could solve that problem, but no one has put in that mutual year of work.
Thank you for listening to us. Thank you, Professor Roth and Granovetter. Thank you, Ryan, and Stanford Video team for hosting us.